all. I'm Moses Rodin, and I just returned to the Philippines from the United States. If you haven't traveled overseas during COVID, but you're thinking about a trip, please take a few minutes and listen to my story. You might change your mind. I traveled from Iloilo in the Philippines to Rockledge, Florida, to visit my family and straighten out some affairs. What should have been a pleasant 3-week vacation turned into 6 weeks of hell, cost me over $10,000, involved well over 100 hours of travel time, 3 weeks of quarantine, 5 PCR tests in a little more than a month, dozens of forms to fill out, and I may well have ended a relationship with one of my relatives. Looking back, it feels like I've lived through a reality show, without the TV cameras and definitely without earning the money. But let my misadventures be your travel guide, and let's discuss traveling overseas during COVID. Now, this is a trip that I'd taken several times before. I knew that 25 to 30 hours, including layovers, is not unusual, and I was prepared for economy class. I brought extra socks and everything, even though some of the stretches on this trip were 12 to 15 hours. My wife Anna and I started planning for this trip well in advance. First thing I did was go to the Philippine Immigration Office and get assurances that I'd be able to return to the Philippines. It would have sucked if they said I couldn't come back. They told me that as long as I'd landed back in the Philippines before the expiration of my 13A probationary visa on June 19th, I'd have no problems. This is actually the one thing that didn't go wrong on this trip. The Philippine authorities were on the top of their game when I got back, and I had no problems returning. Since I'd booked a round-trip ticket from Manila to Orlando on Tuesday, May 25th in the early morning hours, I started looking for a flight from Iloilo to Manila. I only wanted to book a one-way ticket because I knew when I came back there would be some kind of quarantine in Manila, and I didn't want to waste a ticket. The closest ticket I could book was Monday, May 24th, around noon. I knew that it would need a long layover, about 12 hours, but this turned out to be a blessing. Next on my agenda was scheduling the mandatory PCR test. Anyone who flies anywhere overseas has to get one of these. Anna and I looked at the airline website, and we looked at some embassy sites, and the policy was consistent. You had to have your PCR test with a negative result, and it couldn't be older than 72 hours at takeoff from the first connecting flight. Now, since I'd booked the ticket from Iloilo separately, I couldn't figure out if that meant 72 hours before I left Iloilo or 72 hours before I left Manila. And the testing facilities were closed on Sunday, so we went Saturday morning. This would give me, I figured, 8 hours before the plane left from Manila. I got my results Saturday night, thankfully, and it was negative. I packed my carry-on bags on Sunday. I didn't want any check-in baggage because I didn't want any holdups in any airports. The flight from Iloilo to Manila was uneventful, other than the fact that the plane was very crowded. You know, these flights from Iloilo to Manila are no luggage flights, and that made it even more cramped because everybody took their maximum carry-on. I've got to tell you that they suggest double masks and a face shield, and even for a flight that's only 1 or 2 hours, this is not comfortable. But we made it from Iloilo to Manila, and I had almost 12 hours until my flight, so I started looking for something to eat. It's kind of spooky in the Manila airport shopping area. Many, if not most, of the shops are closed. As I continued to travel, I found that this was not unique to Manila Airport. Airports all over the world have had a really tough time during COVID, and shopping, even for food or necessities, is slim pickings. Definitely don't plan on doing any kind of souvenir shopping in the airports. I finally settled on Wendy's for lunch. After lunch, I went to the Qatar Airlines check-in area and settled in for a long wait. I knew that I had 10 hours until flight time, so I flicked on a Netflix movie and I started watching. Next to me was this older Filipino couple. They were extremely well dressed and they had a ton of luggage, but they looked extremely aggravated. I asked the lady what the problem was, and she said that Qatar Airlines had just rejected them from a flight because of their PCR tests. I told her that I understood. I knew the PCR tests were tough, and if you had a flight on a Monday morning or on a Tuesday, it was even more difficult because of the 72-hour window that they gave you. She said, "Oh, you don't know. They changed the rules this morning. The 72-hour window doesn't apply anymore. You now have to have a negative PCR test that's administered less than 48 hours before you land in Doha." The flight from Manila to Doha was almost 15 hours. That meant that you had to have the test and the results back less than 33 hours before takeoff. I was floored. I knew that she had to be wrong. They were an old couple, and I was sure that they just misunderstood. So I decided to go to the Qatar Airlines desk and talk to a representative and just make sure that my PCR test was okay. The Qatar representative asked me for my itinerary, and she asked to look at my COVID test, and she looked at them and said, "Sorry, your COVID test is no longer valid. But don't worry, I'll arrange for a refund on your ticket." I didn't know what to do. I just couldn't believe it. They were going to reject me, and I had just made it to Manila. I hadn't even made it out of the Philippines yet. They were going to turn me back. I actually started feeling kind of claustrophobic. Was I going to have a problem just trying to leave the Philippines? I didn't know what to do. I felt kind of trapped. So I decided, hey, this is the kind of situation that you have to call the U.S. Embassy for. So I excused myself from the Qatar desk. I started looking for the phone number for the U.S. Embassy to ask for help. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I still had 10 hours until flight time. So I told the rep to wait for a few minutes, and I decided maybe I could get a PCR test in time. I went back to her and I asked her if I got another PCR test, would they let me on the flight? She said, "Well, sure. You need to have it by 10 p.m. though, because the flight is a little bit after midnight and we stop accepting passengers 2 hours before flight time." So what did I think? I thought the race was on. I grabbed my bag, I ran out to a taxi area, went up to a waiting driver, and I said, "Look, I have to find a COVID testing center that can do a PCR test in less than 6 hours. Do you think you can do it?" And he said, "I don't know. Most of them take 24 hours. And I said, "I'll give you 2,500 pesos if you can find one." He said, "Get in." Now, just to put this in context, the average Filipino earns about 5,000 pesos a week. So 2,500 pesos is a pretty good fare for just one ride. And I've got to tell you, my driver was amazing. He flew in and out of traffic, and that's really saying something in Manila, because in Manila, traffic barely moves. By the way, if anyone needs a really good friendly driver, let me know, and I'll give you this guy's name and number. He is absolutely amazing. We went to 4 different testing facilities, and they all declined me. None of them said that they could do the test in less than 12 hours. Then the driver said, "I know this place, and I think they can help us." So I get back in the cab, he drives to this upscale area, and he parks in this parking lot where there's a tent set up, and it says One World Swabbing. Now this was a place in a parking lot. It looked kind of shady, but I was desperate. I asked if they could do a COVID test in 6 hours. The The lady said, sure, but instead of 2,000 pesos, we have to charge you 8,000 pesos for a rush fee. I thought that was outrageous, but I was desperate. The driver took me to an ATM and I withdrew the money. We went back to the tent. I gave them the money. They took the sample from my nose and throat and gave me a receipt. I asked when I should come back for the results, and the lady said, oh, don't worry about coming back for the results. We'll email them to you within 4 hours. It was 4 o'clock, and they told me that I'd have my results by 8 o'clock. The airline didn't need it until 10 o'clock. I thought everything was okay. No problem. I confirmed with her one last time. So you're taking it at 4 o'clock. I'll have my results by 8 o'clock, right? And she said, absolutely. So I got back in the cab. The driver took me back to the airport, and I gave him 3,000 pesos. I was so thankful and relieved. This was a great guy. I went back to the Qatar Airlines check-in area, and I went to the rep, and I told her that I'd have my results by email around 8 o'clock. She said that the timing was fine, but an email wasn't acceptable. They needed a printout. I walked around the airport to find some place that would print out the results for me. I even went to a 7-Eleven store, and I asked the guy in the store if he had a printer and he could print it for me, and he said he wasn't allowed to. So finally I found this baggage wrapping station, and they said that they could print it to me. I just needed to have it to them by 9 p.m. when they closed. Another problem was solved. I found myself a comfortable seat, pulled up another Netflix movie, and started watching. Around 7:30, I still hadn't heard from One World Swabbing, so I sent them a friendly email with my name, a picture of my ID, and a copy of their receipt. I told them that I hadn't heard from them, and I just wanted to remind them that my results were promised at 8 p.m. No response. At 8, I still hadn't heard from them, so I sent them a slightly more urgent email. Still no response. At 8:20, I sent them another email that was, less polite. Finally, they sent a response telling me they couldn't find my name in their records. I freaked. I responded with all the information and enclosed a picture of my ID and a receipt again. This was at 8:30. I couldn't believe that I still didn't have my results at 8:30. I was getting really worried that I wouldn't get the results until after 9 o'clock when the wrapping booth would close. Then I wouldn't be able to print them. And if I couldn't print them, Qatar Airlines was not going to accept them. I sent them another urgent email saying the results were no good after 9, and I begged them to hurry. Around 8:45, I got an email saying that they were sorry for the inconvenience, but the 4-hour guarantee started from when the lab picked up the sample, not when I gave the sample. I sent them an email and I said, ma'am, it's not just an inconvenience. There is a time limit to this flight. No one ever told me that it was 4 hours after transportation. I was promised 4 hours almost 5 hours ago. I literally felt the walls closing in on me. I wasn't going to make it past Manila. After working a whole day, I wasn't going to get anywhere. I could feel my blood pressure just start to rise. I waited and I waited. No response to any of my emails. My emails were getting more and more urgent. Finally, at 9:35, I get an email that says they were rerunning my test because it hadn't processed properly. I thought it was all over. I sent them a final email. I said that it was just too late, that they'd hear from my lawyer, and that I was going to have to ask for a refund. I started looking in Google Maps and see if I could find a hotel somewhere near the airport. When, believe it or not, at 10 o'clock, I get one more delayed email from One World Swabbing. I swear, I started to laugh. It was already 6 hours late, and they were still making excuses. I walked out of the airport, and I was waiting for a taxi, when at 10:38, I got this message. Hi, please see the file for the attached results. Sorry for the late reply. Have a safe flight. Thank you. I was stunned. I ran back into the airport. I went to the wrapping booth, and unbelievably, the young man was still there. He had had some late orders and he hadn't closed up yet. I begged him to print out my file. He said that he had to leave, but I offered him 500 pesos to print out that one sheet of paper. Believe it or not, he agreed. He printed out the paper and I ran to the Qatar check-in desk. I was already late. I was hoping that at 10:46 they would still accept my paperwork. Technically, I was still 6 minutes late, but the planets seemed to align for 1 minute and they checked me in. I went through security, went to the gate, and was there when they called for boarding. But believe it or not, this was just the beginning. In the next episode, I'll talk about my trip as an Israeli American traveling on an Arab airline through Doha Airport in the heart of the Arab world. Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you have had any other horror stories during international travel during COVID, post them in the comments. And thanks for watching. Travel safe now.